Hi all, happy Monday. Welcome to the Wife of Caesar. My name is Michele Bien, or Michele Bien, either is fine. As you know, the Wife of Caesar is Streiner's project to talk about corruption or anti-corruption using everyday words so that we can fight corruption in our day-to-day lives with a little bit more than just good intentions. Okay, as in every show, we will discuss a piece of news, a case, and a typology. In the news, we talk about current events that are somehow related to corruption or anti-corruption. In the case, we talk about relevant cases of corruption or anti-corruption. And in the typology, we teach you how to commit corrupt acts. All right, so today's news is related to SOMPA and the first meeting of the AFA Sanctions Committee. Okay. A little bit of background. In 2016, France passed a law known as, it's got a very lengthy name, but it's known colloquially as Sapin 2 or Sapin 2. And it is France's response to the phenomenon of foreign bribery. Okay, so that's the law in France that regulates the crime of going abroad, going to a different country, and paying a bribe. Okay. Now, this law contemplates the creation of the AFA, the French Anti-Corruption Agency. Now, the AFA functions as an investigation body that also issues administrative sanctions for the crime of corruption. Now, this is kind of tricky because you don't necessarily have to commit the crime of bribery or foreign bribery to be sanctioned by the AFA. It is enough to fail to have an effective compliance program, as with other laws that we've discussed. And, well, when the AFA investigates a serious claim or brings an administrative claim for sanction, it sort of splits in two. It sort of wears two hats. We have the AFA that functions as a prosecutor or as a prosecution of sorts, and the AFA Sanctions Committee, which is still a part of the agency, but it is created, or it is conformed by independent judges who evaluate the claims brought by the prosecuting AFA and decide to administer sanctions. Okay, so first and foremost, these are administrative proceedings, so not criminal. We're not dealing with crimes, even though bribery is a crime. Here, the sanctions are more on the administrative side, so non-criminal. And again, they are not judging whether or not bribery was committed, but they judge whether or not the compliance program, the anti-corruption compliance program of a company, is effective enough to prevent corruption. Okay, so what happened here was that the AFA decided to meet after it brought an investigation against SOMPA. SOMPA is a French company that deals with production and sale of electrical equipment, obviously in France and abroad. And in this meeting, the AFA committee mainly evaluated whether SOMPA effectively mapped risk. Okay, so the French law establishes that there are 8 sort of pillars on which an effective compliance program has to rest. So these 8 things that your compliance program has to have to be considered effective. One of those things is the mapping of risk, or what they call a cartography of risk. And this is actually fairly unique to French law. And it means that every company has the obligation to measure what risks they have internally of committing corruption and adjusting their compliance program to those risks. Now, if the mapping of the risks or the cartography is not effective, or it doesn't accurately reflect the actual risks of the company, then the compliance program will obviously be less than adequate. And well, here the AFA argued that the mapping the mapping that SOMPA had was not effective. Now, SOMPA argued that a recognized auditor, probably one of the big 4, created and developed the risk mapping, and even collected a fee of 119,000 euro, which was, in retrospective, a poor choice. for an argument to bring, because the AFA in turn argued that the mapping did not accurately reflect the specific risks that fell on this company, that applied to the company, that it didn't include sufficient employee interviews. There were several employees and only a handful of interviews were considered in the mapping, and that it didn't include all of the entirety of the audit reports. So essentially the external auditor issued several reports on the mapping, and Sompar failed to disclose all of those reports. And finally, well, the committee said, it doesn't matter to us really how much you spend on the audit. If it's not effective, it's not effective, which was, again, a poor choice of argument if you ask me. Okay, the AFA, wearing its prosecutor hat, requested to the committee that it issue an order or an injunction of sorts, essentially a judicial, well, not an administrative order compelling the company to implement or to enhance its compliance program so that it would conform to the 8 requirements of the law, and failing that, to impose a fine of 1 million euros to the company and 200,000 euros to its director. Now, after the meeting, the committee had essentially 5 days to issue a ruling, and they have issued this ruling, and essentially it lets the company off the hook, but it does require that the company implement or enhance its compliance program to conform to the law. Obviously, the AFA will continue to monitor whether or not this program is effective, and if the company doesn't do it, then they will likely face a hefty fine. But they were essentially let off the hook. Now, this is relevant, or it's important, because even though it doesn't involve a huge sum or a huge fine, this was the first meeting of the AFA and the Sanctions Committee, and this will tell us or set a precedent for how the AFA will conduct future committee meetings. And as we've mentioned before, the laws of other countries concerning foreign bribery tend to be applied extrajudicially. And even though the AFA Sanctions Committee is not a member of the judiciary, it's not an adjudicator, a judge, or a court, it does perform the functions of a court, or adjudicating functions. So this is interesting because it means further development, or at least a more developed law based on precedent than we have been used to from the FCPA and from US authorities. All the information for our case came from Nicolas Tollet of Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, Paris compliance head. And thank you, Nicolas, for the information. Okay, let's move on to the case. Now, this week, we will talk about Densk Bank. Densk Bank was in the news recently this week because they hired a new compliance officer from the former compliance officer of HSBC. And as we know, HSBC has been implicated in several money laundering schemes involving Latin American cartels. And so now Densk Bank has recruited the former compliance officer of HSBC, and he will enter the Densk Bank ranks, I think, on July 15th. Okay, what happened with Densk is that they were involved in a huge money laundering scandal involving about 200 billion euro. The bank is essentially accused of laundering money through their Estonia branch into Europe and essentially into the UK, and laundering money for several criminal outfits or syndicates from Russia and other Slavic countries. In 2007, the Estonia Bank of Danske was opened, and even the Estonian regulators and the Russian Central Bank issued alerts, essentially warning that several irregular operations presented risk of crimes. Now, Danske decided to ignore this and continue its operations. Other banks facing these operations, facing these accusations or these red flags, other banks decided to pull out of Estonia. Banks such as JP Morgan Chase decided to pull out of Estonia because the risk was too high. Danske nonetheless decided to maintain operations in Estonia, and later it was found via an email, a whistleblowing email that was issued by Mr. Howard Wilkinson, who was the head of Estonia markets, that the bank was knowingly doing business with criminal entities. Now, what they were doing is that money from criminal outfits from Russia and from Azerbaijan and Moldova were funneling money into Danske, and via sophisticated financial schemes whereby the bank purchased securities in rubles and then sold those securities off in dollars, and then those dollared accounts were then issued and used in masking the operations and inserting funds into the financial system. Following the email, the bank decided to withdraw from Estonia, but failed to disclose to the relevant authorities that it had withdrawn because of illegal activity or suspected illicit activity. Now, in 2018, it was uncovered that Mr. Thomas Borgen actually received those reports and dismissed them as unimportant. But it turns out that during 2013, Mr. Borgen was the actual head of the Estonia branch. And so that means that he himself might have been involved in these operations, and there's a very clear conflict of interest. As you know, HSBC was involved in several money laundering schemes involving Latin American cartels. And again, this came to us via the news that Danske decided to investigate and hire a new compliance officer to investigate these allegations for money laundering and to resolve any issues that they might have. Okay, so let's move on to the typology. Today we have a typology for money laundering, which is not exactly corruption, but is very closely related, because any proceeds from corruption have to be laundered to be used in the real world. And this typology is called smurfing, after the Smurfs. Okay. So basically, to sort of give a little background, what is money laundering? It is taking dirty money and passing it off as clean money. Okay, and essentially, let's not get too technical here, but there are basically 3 steps to any money laundering activity: the placement, the layering or masking, and the integration stages. Now, during the placement stage, you introduce the dirty money into the financial system. Now, this might be via a cash-only business, so like a restaurant, or very stereotypically a laundromat, or things like that, monies that are based on cash. The second stage, known as layering or masking, essentially means that essentially is when you perform many operations of a diverse nature to hide the true origin of the funds. So think of it this way: you have all of your dirty money you put it into your business, and then that business does many operations involving foreign entities and shell companies and strawman and other things like that, and they move funds from one country to another and from one business to another, and sometimes in cash and sometimes in traveler's checks. The idea is to throw off the scent any person who is following the money. And then you move on to the integration stage, and that's when you take that money that's already been masked or layered, and you reintroduce it into the economy with seemingly regular operations, such as buying a house or starting a new business or other things. And when you're done with that, well, your money appears to be squeaky clean. Okay, now smurfing actually takes place right here during the layer or masking stage. And in smurfing, what you do is you essentially break up large amounts that come from the proceeds of crime, and you have, let's say, $200 billion that are the proceeds of crime, and you break them up into very tiny amounts. And we're talking about 100 euros, 400 euros, so relatively small sums, and you use them to buy regular things. And those operations might be fake or might not be fake, but the problem is that they are so tiny or so relatively tiny that it's very hard to follow them. On the other hand, the problem with that is that you need to involve several people. A lot of the times what they do is they employ students, struggling professionals, sometimes homeless people, to help them in performing these operations. And the problem with that is that it's too risky, because it leaves too many loose ends for the criminals who are actually laundering the money. This typology can be very effective, but fortunately the authorities are already very aware of it. So it's kind of hard to actually do smurfing effectively. Okay, so that was it for today. Thank you for joining us. As always, I will leave you with this. Every act of corruption has to be denounced. It has to be reported. So please blow the whistle, but do so safely. If you're not sure whether or not what you're looking at is corruption, or you're not sure that you are personally safe, don't do anything, refrain from acting, and reach out to someone who can help you. Feel free to reach out to us at info@streiner.mx, or you can log on to our website, streiner.mx, and there you will find detailed instructions to blow the whistle anonymously and through the dark web so that you can stay safe. So feel free to write us if you need help, but above all, stay safe. This was, again, The Wife of Caesar. My name is Michel Levien, or Michel Levien. Either's fine. And thank you for joining us. Happy Monday.